There are kings who built empires out of marble and iron. And then there was Henry VIII, a man who built his empire out of flesh, fear, and blood. His story begins like a fairy tale of golden youth. A young prince born in the year 1509, radiant, athletic, and brilliant. He spoke Latin and French, danced until dawn, played music that melted hearts, and was said to have calves so perfect that ambassadors compared them to sculpture. But behind that glow was a hunger that would turn England into a graveyard of wives, saints, and enemies. Henry wasn't born a monster. He became one carved slowly by power, lust, and the fear of dying without a son. When his older brother Arthur died, Henry suddenly became heir to the throne and, not long after, king. He inherited a wife, along with the crowned Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow. Their marriage began with laughter and alliances. But years passed, and Catherine bore him only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. The absence of a son gnawed at him like an infection. To Henry, no son meant no legacy, no divine proof that God favoured him. And in that desperate wound, Anne Boleyn appeared clear, bold, and French-educated, unlike any woman he had known. When she refused to be just another mistress, Henry's obsession with her transformed from desire to religion. To have her, he would break not only vows but the spine of Christendom itself. He begged the Pope for an annulment, claiming his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once belonged to his brother. But Rome would not yield. So Henry did what no English king had dared before he split England from the Catholic Church, burned bridges with the Pope, and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. It was both blasphemy and genius, a revolution disguised as romance. Anne Boleyn became queen, pregnant and triumphant, parading through London beneath golden banners. But when the baby arrived, it wasn't the prince he prayed for. It was a daughter named Elizabeth. Henry smiled through clenched teeth. The woman he had crowned a queen for love became, in his mind, another failure of fate. His temper grew monstrous. Whispers followed Anne through the court that she mocked the king's body, that she bewitched him, that she had betrayed him with her brother. Cromwell, his cold-blooded minister, gathered the rumours, stitched them into law, and handed them to Henry like a dagger. In the year 1536, Anne was dragged to the Tower of London. They say she stood calm as a stone, even joked that her neck was slender. Henry granted her mercy of a French swordsman instead of the axe. When the blade fell, the crowd gasped, and somewhere deep within the palace, the king feasted as if the act had cleansed him. 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour, the quiet one, the one who promised him peace, and she gave him what the others could not, a son. But childbirth took her life, leaving him a widower again, staring at the infant who would one day become Edward VI. From that point, Henry's body began to decay as quickly as his soul. In his youth, he had jousted with the force of a god, but in the tournament of the year 1536, his horse crashed down upon him, crushing his leg and nearly ending his life. He survived, but something inside him shattered. The wound festered, ulcers erupted, and the smell of rot clung to his chambers. He grew grotesquely fat, needing pulleys to lift him onto his horse. His temper, once theatrical, became terrifying. Servants trembled, nobles vanished. The man who once sang love songs now ruled through terror, as if blood itself were a kind of prayer. And yet, he could still charm when he wished. He wrote music, collected dogs, and lavished gifts upon his wives before killing them. When he met Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, he imagined beauty and diplomacy in one. What he got, he claimed, was ugliness. A Flanders mare. He sneered. The marriage lasted 6 months. She escaped with her head and a fortune, calling him brother ever after. Not everyone was so lucky. Catherine Howard, young and foolish, was caught in an affair and paid for it with her neck. By the time his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, arrived, Henry was more corpse than king, rotting in silk, ruled by paranoia, and haunted by ghosts of the women he'd destroyed. By the year 1547, his vast frame could barely move, and the air around his bed was said to reek of decay. His courtiers whispered of divine punishment, of ulcers that oozed and would not heal. Some believed it was syphilis. Others, madness, the inheritance of a cursed bloodline. His mind flickered between guilt and fury. He signed executions with the same hand that once wrote love letters. He drank, he raged, and finally, in the cold of January, he died, leaving behind a kingdom, trembling between ruin and rebirth. But death did not silence him. His shadow stretched into the reigns of his children, Edward, the frail boy king who died at 15, Mary, who bathed England in the fire of heresy trials, and Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would turn her mother's shame into glory. Through them, Henry's ghost ruled still, whispering from his marble tomb that England's crown was forged in both love and sin. So when we remember Henry VIII, we remember not just the man who had 6 wives and 57,000 executions to his name, but the paradox of him, a monarch who built the modern English state by tearing apart the sacred order of the world. A king who called himself God's chosen yet lived like a demon. A man whose heart rotted long before his body did. And perhaps that's why his story refuses to die, because beneath the crown and the legend, Henry wasn't just a tyrant. He was the embodiment of what happens when desire becomes doctrine and power replaces faith. His life was not just insane. It was a sermon written in blood, and England would spend centuries trying to wash it off. The death of Henry VIII left England in a silence that felt both sacred and rotten, as if the country itself were catching its breath after surviving a storm too long. The court still smelled faintly of his sickness, of linen soaked in vinegar, and the sour perfume of rot that once followed him like a curse. Yet even before his heavy body was laid into its marble tomb at Windsor, the kingdom's attention had already shifted to the small, pale boy who would be King Edward, his long-awaited son, the fragile miracle born from Jane Seymour's deathbed. In him the court saw redemption. In him Henry had believed he had carved immortality. But what no one dared to say aloud was that the boy who inherited a throne of iron was already standing on a foundation of ghosts. Every decision that had made his birth possible had been paid for in blood, his mother's, his father's wives, and perhaps even England's soul. Edward was only 9 when he was crowned, a child with eyes too large for his thin face, clutching the golden orb that seemed to weigh more than his whole body. The crown slid down his forehead because it had been forged for a man. The courtiers smiled through their teeth, whispering prayers that he would live long enough to grow into it. He was intelligent, serious, a lover of books and scripture, but no amount of learning could prepare him for the invisible war around him. England under Henry had been ripped in half, Catholic against Protestant, tradition against reform, and this small boy, with his trembling hands and scholarly heart, was meant to hold it together. His council was full of wolves wearing silk. The most cunning among them was Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the king's uncle, and the man who made himself protector of the realm. He spoke of faith, of God's plan for England, but his true prayers were whispered, not to heaven, but to power. Under Somerset's rule, England grew harder and poorer. The monasteries his brother Henry had destroyed left thousands without homes or hope. Fields turned wild, The poor wandered like ghosts, and rebellion flared from Cornwall to Norfolk. Edward watched from his golden chair, trying to make sense of sermons about divine destiny, while hearing the cries of a nation starving in his name. He wrote in his diary with a neat, childlike hand notes about executions, battles, and pestilence, as if the record itself could give order to the chaos. But history does not forgive innocence. Somerset's wars in Scotland bled the treasury dry, and when his enemies rose against him, they did not hesitate to whisper treason in the boy king's ear. Edward signed his uncle's death warrant with quiet obedience, perhaps believing that justice demanded it. When the axe fell, the protector's head rolled into a basket, and the child who had been taught mercy learned how easily mercy dies. The next shadow to fall over him was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a man who smiled like a friend and plotted like a viper. He flattered the young king's intellect, fed his zeal for the new Protestant faith, and convinced him that God's kingdom on earth could be written into law. Churches were stripped of images and relics, priests married. Latin was replaced with English so that even the unlearned could read God's word, or at least Northumberland's version of it. Edward, still fragile and earnest, believed he was saving souls. He did not see that he was being used as a weapon in the hands of men who served only themselves. He coughed often, a deep, rattling sound that filled his nights with fever. The doctors called it a chill, then a consumption, then something nameless that ate him from within. Yet he kept writing, kept signing decrees, his small signature sprawling across documents that remade the faith of millions. When it became clear that he would not live to see manhood, panic gripped the court. The memory of his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, haunted the Protestant lords like a spectre of vengeance. If Mary took the throne, all their reforms, all their blood-stained progress would crumble. So Northumberland spun his final web. He persuaded the dying king to name Lady Jane Grey, his cousin and Northumberland's daughter-in-law, as heir. Jane was 16, brilliant, devout, and doomed. When Edward breathed his last in the summer of 1553, the bells of London tolled for a king who had been more idea than man, and within days, those same bells tolled again for a queen who never wanted her crown. Jane's reign lasted 9 days, 9 breaths of treacherous quiet before Mary's army swept through the capital like divine retribution. The girl was dragged to the Tower, and later beheaded, her small hands trembling as she forgave the world that had used her. Edward's dream of a pure Protestant kingdom died with her, and the wind shifted once more. Mary Tudor, Henry's firstborn, rode into London with a grim smile and the fire of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, burning in her veins. The people cheered, calling her the rightful queen, the saviour who would restore England to Rome. For the first time in years, church bells rang for the Mass again. Incense filled the cathedrals, and Latin prayers echoed beneath vaulted stone. But Mary was not the gentle saviour she imagined herself to be. She had grown up watching her father discard her mother, strip her title, and call her illegitimate. Every humiliation hardened her into a woman of iron, faith, and deep wound. She believed her throne was God's justice, and anyone who defied that justice would burn. Within months, the fires of Smithfield were lit, and the heretics screamed her father's name as they turned to ash. Mary prayed louder to drown them out. History would name her Bloody Mary. Though she believed herself only obedient, she longed for love, for redemption in the arms of a husband, and found it in Philip of Spain. Cold, distant, and calculating. Their marriage was meant to unite kingdoms, but it only deepened England's resentment. Philip's dark eyes and foreign tongue made the people whisper that their queen had sold the nation to Spain. Mary wept in private, clinging to her rosary, convinced that if she could bear a child, God would silence all doubt. Her belly swelled. Her servants prepared a nursery. Bells were ready to ring for the heir. But the months passed, and the baby never came. What she carried was not life, but a phantom, a swelling of grief and faith twisted into delusion. When her body deflated, so did her hope. Even her husband left her, returning to his wars abroad. Alone and haunted by failure, Mary turned her fury back to her sister Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman she blamed. For all her pain, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower, accused of conspiracy, pacing the same cold stones where her mother Anne had awaited execution. She listened to the rain drip through the roof and wondered if it was the same rain that had fallen the day her mother died. She did not cry. She read. She wrote. She learned the art of silence because silence, she realized, could be armor. After months of isolation, Mary relented. Sickened by guilt or perhaps superstition, she released her sister but kept her under watch. Elizabeth returned to Hatfield, where she lived quietly among her books, her face expressionless, whenever news came from London of another pyre burning. She understood that survival was not about courage, but about timing. Mary's reign, built on smoke and prayer, began to crumble. The phantom pregnancy returned once more, crueler than before. Her stomach swelled again, her breasts filled, and courtiers prepared for a miracle. But again, no child came. This time the swelling was the beginning of her death, a tumor, perhaps, or divine irony. On a grey November morning in the year 1558, the Queen of England, daughter of Catherine, wife of Philip, enemy of heresy, breathed her last. The bells tolled again. Not for victory, but for exhaustion. The fires went out. The air cleared. And England, bruised by 20 years of religious whiplash, turned its eyes to the only Tudor left, standing the red-haired woman with her mother's eyes and her father's fire. When Elizabeth stepped into the sunlight of her coronation, the people roared as if heaven itself had opened. Yet beneath her golden gown and calm smile, she carried a lifetime of ghosts, a father who killed her mother, a brother who died too young, a sister who tried to burn her, and a country that had learned to pray to whichever god would not kill them. The crown felt heavier than it looked. As she lifted it, she whispered a private vow that no man would ever have the power to take it from her. The court saw grace. History would later see strategy. In that moment, she became something England had never seen before, a queen who would not marry, who would not share her rule, and who would turn survival into an art form. The girl once branded illegitimate now held the kingdom her father had built and broken. Her reign would outlast them all. But that is another story. For now, the tale of Henry's legacy is not of kings, but of the children left behind a boy who ruled too soon, a woman who burned her faith into the soil, and a daughter who would rebuild from ashes. Together, they were the echo of his madness, the living proof that one man's obsession could reshape the soul of a nation. England had survived Henry VIII, but it had become something else entirely, neither Catholic nor Protestant, neither pure nor damned, a kingdom suspended between heaven and hell, waiting for a queen to decide which way it would fall. By the time Henry reached his middle years, the man who once dazzled Europe as a golden prince had become a creature of shadow and sweat. His body, once carved like marble, began to betray him, and every inch of flesh seemed to swell with punishment. The court still bowed to him with trembling devotion, but whispers moved faster than prayer. The king's leg was festering again. The smell of death followed him. The blood would not stop seeping through the bandages. Physicians came and went like priests to a cursed altar, each one offering a new salve, a new charm, a new lie. But no one could cure the rot, because it did not only live in his leg, it lived in his mind. The pain had become his shadow, and the shadow had begun to rule. The accident that started it was simple. A tilt in the lists on a cold January day, in the year 1536. Henry, armoured and shining, galloped into the joust like a god of war, but the horse stumbled, and the king fell beneath it. For a moment the crowd thought he was dead. The earth swallowed his body and did not move. When he was pulled from the wreck, his leg was crushed, and his head had struck the ground with such force that his mind seemed never to wake up the same. From that day forward, his moods swung like blades in a storm. The wound refused to heal. It opened and oozed and burned. The pain crawled up his spine, into his temper, into his dreams. He raged at the doctors, struck servants, and woke screaming in the night. The court learned to read his footsteps the way sailors read the sea. A quiet step meant safety. A heavy one meant blood. They said he used vinegar baths to clean the ulcers. That the air of his chambers grew so foul, servants fainted when they entered. He refused to let the wound rest. Vanity demanded he still wear his silks and garters, the tight gold-threaded bands that strangled the blood in his calves. He had once been proud of those legs. The Venetian ambassador had called them the finest in Christendom, and now they betrayed him. Leaking and swollen, the skin blackening like fruit left too long in the sun. But to Henry, the body was not a cage. It was a throne, and even rotting, it was still divine. He would not admit decay, so he masked it with perfume and velvet, with jewels and laughter, as if spectacle could hide the stench of dying flesh. As his body broke, his appetites grew. He devoured everything: food, women, loyalty. Banquets became rituals of defiance. The table groaned under roasted swans, pies of venison, flagons of wine and beer. He drank until dawn and blamed his priests when the pain worsened. "God tests his kings," he said through gritted teeth, "and I am his chosen iron." In truth, he was afraid. Afraid of death. Afraid of weakness. Afraid that God had turned his face away. He ordered the court to laugh in his presence, to praise his health, to speak of his virility. None dared tell him that the smell of his ulcers reached 3 rooms away. When the pain grew unbearable, he called his surgeons, and they came with iron rods heated in the fire until they glowed red. They pressed the metal to his wounds to burn away the corruption. The screams shook the palace walls. There was no anesthetic, no mercy. The king clutched the arms of his chair until his knuckles split, swearing he could feel the fire driving out the devil in his flesh. But the ulcers only widened, and infection crawled back within days. Sometimes the pus burst through the bandages during council meetings, and he would grimace but continue dictating laws about God and obedience, as if ruling the kingdom harder might keep his body from falling apart. The courtiers pretended not to notice. They praised his intellect, his music, his wisdom. They called him majesty, a word he had chosen himself, because highness was not divine enough. In his mind, he was no longer just a king. He was the living hand of God, anointed not by Rome but by his own will. And so, when his body failed him, it was not illness, it was blasphemy. He accused fate itself of treason. He beheaded nobles who doubted him, executed old friends who hesitated to kneel. The sword that had once defended his realm now served as medicine for his pride. Each death, he told himself, was necessary. Each drop of blood spilled was the price of order. But as the years wore on, it was clear that order had turned into terror. By the year 1540, the man who had once ridden into battle now had to be hoisted onto his horse by ropes. The sight of it was so humiliating that he forbade witnesses. The same legs that once dazzled Europe were now swollen pillars of pain. His armor had to be widened twice. His final suit of plate measured a waist of 52 inches, the circumference of a man who had devoured himself. When he could no longer ride, he built palaces closer to the river, so he could travel by barge. He filled them with mirrors, music, and mechanical toys. Anything to distract him from the fact that he was becoming a prisoner inside his own skin. Some said it was divine justice. Others whispered it was syphilis, the fruit of his many sins. But the truth was simpler, crueler. It was the slow collapse of a body never meant to bear the weight of an empire. The ulcers, the obesity, the rage, all were the symptoms of a king who had mistaken appetite for destiny. And yet, in the midst of the horror, there were moments that almost seemed human. He would cradle his dogs in silk cushions, feeding them by hand. He wrote songs still, sweet melodies about lost love and the passing of time. Servants swore they heard him play softly in the dark, the sound echoing through the halls like a ghost of the young prince he once was. But tenderness could not survive long under the crown. When the pain returned, he lashed out again. He accused his last wife, Catherine Parr, of heresy for daring to argue theology with him. She escaped execution only by weeping before him, reminding him of his vanity, and he relented. Those near him lived by instinct, like animals near a wounded beast. One wrong word, one glance of pity, could mean death. Even the courtiers learned to speak of his illness only as the humour in his Majesty's legs. To suggest that the king was dying was treason. For the king was England, and England could not die. In his final years, the line between man and throne blurred completely. He no longer cared for policy, only for control. He built fortresses along the coast, paranoid that the Pope would send armies to drag him to hell. He dreamed of betrayal, saw ghosts of his wives in the shadows, their faces pale beneath their veils. He spoke to them in the dark, asking if they forgave him. They never answered. The pain worsened. The infection spread, and his doctors began to fear even touching him. They drained the ulcers daily, the fluid filling basins like melted wax. When the fever came, he begged for more wine, for more music, for more prayer, as if the sheer noise of living might drown out death. On his last night, January the 28th of the year, 1547, the king who had remade England lay in his vast bed, surrounded by priests who dared not speak. His face was bloated, his lips cracked. He asked for the sacrament, then changed his mind, muttering that no priest could forgive what he had done. The courtiers wept, not from love, but from terror. Without him, none of them knew who they were. As dawn approached, the man who had called himself God's instrument began to choke on his own breath. His last words were not a prayer but a command. Monks, monks, more monks, as if the ghosts of the old faith had come to drag him back to Rome. Then the body that had been both kingdom and curse went still. When they tried to move the coffin to Windsor, the weight of it broke the cart, and the corpse burst open on the stones, spilling foul fluids onto the ground. Witnesses swore that dogs licked the blood away. Others said the smell lingered for weeks, seeping into the earth itself. It was a fitting end for a man who had feasted on power until it consumed him. His tomb bore the Latin words Rex Invictus, the unconquered king, though in truth he had been conquered by his own flesh long before the grave claimed him. The legend of Henry VIII is often told through his wives, his politics, his break with Rome. But beneath those histories lies a simpler, darker truth. His body became the map of his reign. Every ulcer, every pound, every drop of blood mirrored the empire he built, glorious, grotesque, and dying from the inside out. The man who once believed himself immortal, learned. Too late. That king's rot like everyone else. Yet in that rot, England was reborn, shaped by his madness into a new world that would outlive him. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony of all, that the body which stank of death gave birth to a nation that would never stop pretending it was chosen by God. When Anne Boleyn first entered Henry's life, she was not a seductress, not a witch, and not yet a queen. She was a woman of words, a creature of wit and fire, in a court that expected silence from its women. Her laughter had the sound of defiance. Her eyes did not lower when men spoke. That alone made her dangerous. To Henry, she was a spark in the gloom of a loveless marriage. A woman who could look him in the face and not tremble. That was the beginning of his undoing the first time. Desire looked him in the eye and saw weakness. Anne had returned to England from the courts of Burgundy and France, where she had learned that power could live inside perfume and smiles, that a queen could command with the curl of a wrist. She wore the lessons of those French ladies like armor. When Henry saw her, it was as if the old gods had sent him temptation in human form. He had already taken her sister, Mary Boleyn, to bed, and the irony did not escape him. But Anne refused him not with rebellion, but with art. She gave him hope. Then silence. Then glimpses of her hand, the turn of her neck, a smile sharp enough to draw blood. When the King of England began writing letters like a lovesick boy, the court laughed in whispers. But Anne was not playing for romance. She was playing for survival. Henry's letters, still preserved centuries later, are the strangest relics of power ever written. I beg you to remember me, he wrote, and to wish yourself with your servant. The words that would one day order beheadings were, at that moment, trembling with lust. He begged for her, promised the world, swore that he would make her queen, and in those promises, he set fire to Europe. For there was one obstacle between them, Catherine of Aragon, his lawful wife and queen of 20 years. To cast her aside was to defy Rome itself. But Henry believed his passion was divine. He told himself that God had punished him with a daughter because his marriage was cursed. Because Catherine had once belonged to his brother. It was convenient theology, born not from scripture, but from obsession. The Pope refused to grant an annulment. Henry's pride curdled into fury. He turned against the church, against his own faith. Declaring himself supreme head of religion in England, monasteries burned, priests fled, relics of centuries were smashed to dust. And through it all, Anne stood by him, radiant and unbowed, believing that she had helped midwife a new world. When she finally became queen, crowned in a spectacle of gold and trumpets, she was already carrying the child Henry believed would redeem him. But when she gave birth in September of the year 1533, and they placed the child in her arms, she saw not a prince, but a daughter. She named her Elizabeth. Henry smiled thinly. The smile did not reach his eyes. The years that followed turned from dream to nightmare. Anne's laughter, once his addiction, began to grate on him. Her intelligence became insolence. Her politics, interference. She miscarried, and he began to mutter that she was bewitched. The courtiers who had once sung her praises now plotted her downfall, led by Thomas Cromwell, the king's cold-eyed minister who saw the wind shifting. Henry's glance grew colder each week. It began visiting a quiet, gentle lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour, Anne's opposite in every way. The court smelled blood. Cromwell gathered whispers like a spider gathers flies. He accused Anne of adultery, not with one man, but with several. Even her own brother. The charges were obscene, impossible, and yet precisely the kind Henry needed to free himself. On the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She did not weep. She walked through the gate with her head high, her black eyes bright with disbelief. They gave her a small chamber overlooking the courtyard, the same one where she had once watched tournaments. From that window, she could see the scaffold being built. In her final days, she wrote a letter to Henry. Never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and affection. She said. The parchment trembled with her last pride. He never answered. Instead, he ordered a French swordsman to come from Calais, "A cleaner death," he said. "Quicker and merciful." On the morning of the 19th of May, Anne, dressed in grey damask, knelt before the crowd and prayed aloud. "I commend my soul to God," she said, "and to his mercy I do not accuse any man." The sword fell before the words had faded. The head rolled forward, and the crowd gasped at the swiftness of it, mercy in motion. Henry remarried. 11 days later, Jane Seymour, pale and obedient, replaced Anne like one shadow, replacing another. She gave him the son he had sacrificed so many lives for Edward, the sickly boy who would die before his beard grew in. Jane died within days of the birth, her blood soaking the bed that had once been Anne's. Henry called her his true wife, and in that phrase lay his confession. The others had been steps, accidents, obstacles. Jane's death sealed her perfection. She could never defy him now. The court whispered again. The king was cursed. 2 queens dead, 1 banished. The land itself uneasy. Yet Henry did not repent. He grew larger, more monstrous, as if his grief had to fill every room. He built palaces like fortress, filled them with paintings of himself as saint and Caesar. He had become his own religion, and his wives were the sacrifices on his altar. His enemies were easy to find: men who spoke too freely, women who dared to look away. He could no longer tell the difference between fear and loyalty, between love and worship. And so Anne Boleyn became more than a ghost. She became the shape of his guilt, a presence that haunted every woman who followed. Catherine Howard, Anne's cousin, would be accused of the same sins and lose her head on the same block. Catherine Parr would survive only by mastering the art of surrender. Elizabeth, the daughter Henry once despised, would grow up watching it all and learn the most dangerous lesson of all: that in England, love was fatal, and silence was power. Anne's body was buried beneath the Tower Chapel without a coffin, beside others who had once laughed too loudly. But her eyes, they said, did not close right away. They glimmered in the straw for a heartbeat longer, as if still searching for the man who had promised her the world. And perhaps, in some cruel way, he kept his promise, for the world still remembers her name long after the man who killed her has turned to dust. The axe fell only once, but the echo has never stopped. When Jane Seymour entered Henry's orbit, the palace sighed with relief, as if a gentle wind had drifted into a room that had been choking on smoke for years. She was not a woman of flame like Anne Boleyn, nor one who challenged men with her tongue. She was soft-spoken, pale as moonlight, and seemed born to soothe rather than to conquer. Her hands folded perfectly in her lap, her gaze lowered just enough to please, and her silence became a kind of music Henry could no longer hear anywhere else. After years of noise trials, executions, and curses, her quiet seemed divine. But beneath that quiet, history was holding its breath. For nothing in Henry's world ever ended in peace. She had served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. She had seen queens rise and die, and she had learned the first rule of survival in the Tudor court: never let the king feel opposed. When he began to look at her, Jane did not flirt, she retreated. When he wrote her love letters, she returned them unopened. When he sent her gifts, she refused them. That restraint was her weapon. Henry, accustomed to women who trembled before his will or fought it with wit, found himself obsessed with one who neither resisted nor surrendered. He called her pure. Others called her clever. Whatever she was, she became the shape of his redemption, the woman who would heal the wound Anne had left. The court's gossip whispered that Henry had fallen in love before Anne's head hit the straw. Within days of the execution, Jane's family home was being prepared for royal visits. By May's end, Henry had married her in a small ceremony held in secret, the third wedding in as many years. Even his courtiers stopped trying to feign surprise. They simply prayed this one would not end in blood. Jane carried herself like a ghost amid a court that stank of death. She asked for the restoration of Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine, to the line of succession. It was an act of kindness that astonished everyone. An olive branch extended toward the woman whose mother Henry had cast away. In that moment, Jane seemed less a wife than a balm upon an open wound. Henry, in turn, declared her his one true queen, as if naming her such could erase the graves behind him. But Jane's greatest gift was the one that would kill her. By the summer of the year 1537, she was heavy with child, and Henry's mood brightened for the first time in years. The palace became a cathedral of hope. Priests prayed day and night for a son. Musicians were commanded to compose new hymns. Banners were stitched. Feasts planned for a birth that had not yet come. Jane bore the weight of the kingdom in her womb, her body swelling with the desperate faith of generations. In October, labor began. It lasted 3 days and 3 nights. A torment so prolonged that even the hardened midwives whispered prayers through their teeth. When the child finally emerged a boy, living and strong, Henry fell to his knees and wept. They named him Edward. The king called him a miracle, a sign that God had forgiven him. For a brief and golden moment, England was quiet. Bells rang across the land. Fires were lit in every village. The king who had torn the world apart to have a son now had his heir. And in his joy, he forgot to notice that the mother who had given it to him was dying. Jane lay pale and still, fever burning through her body. Infection spread from the wounds of childbirth, and no physician dared touch her without trembling. Henry sat beside her bed, refusing to accept what he saw. He spoke to her of the boy, of the future, of the peace they would know. She smiled once, a ghost of a smile, and whispered that it had been worth it. 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour died. Henry did not attend her funeral. He ordered the court into mourning and then locked himself away for weeks. They said he sat alone, staring at her portrait, drinking until he fell asleep in his chair. For the first time in his life, the king who thought himself chosen by God looked like a man punished by him. Jane's death was the one wound he would never stop touching. He had her buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the resting place of kings, and declared he would one day lie beside her. Every queen who came after would live in the shadow of that grave. In his mind, Jane became perfect because she could no longer speak, no longer disappoint him. She had given him a son and taken his sins with her into the earth. After her death, Henry was no longer capable of gentleness. The joy that Edward's birth had brought curdled into bitterness. He grew heavier, slower, and crueler. The old wound in his leg reopened, the stench returning. Pain made him monstrous again. Ministers came and went, each believing they could manage his fury. None lasted long. The court had learned that Henry's moods were the weather of England when he smiled. The kingdom thrived. When he raged, heads rolled. Yet in his loneliness, he began to seek companionship again. Europe sent him portraits of princesses like offerings to a god who might destroy them. The first to catch his attention was Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman chosen for diplomacy rather than beauty. The artist Hans Holbein painted her, and Henry fell in love with the portrait. The calm face, the golden hair, the softness of her gaze. But when she arrived in England, reality betrayed art. She was plain, awkward, her accent thick. When Henry met her in disguise, hoping to surprise her like a knight in a romance, she did not recognize him. He felt humiliated. "I like her not," he said. The marriage lasted 6 months. Anne, wiser than the rest, accepted an annulment with grace, called him brother, and lived out her days comfortably in England. She was the only one who ever left his side alive and unbroken. The next wife, Catherine Howard, was not so lucky. She was young, reckless, and beautiful, barely out of girlhood. To Henry, she was a glimpse of youth restored. He showered her with jewels, called her his rose without thorn, and strutted like a man reborn. But Catherine's heart still beat with the wildness of her age. When her past lovers came to light, when whispers reached the king that she had been unfaithful, his love turned to rage faster than a blade can flash. She was dragged to the tower, crying that she was innocent. On the day of her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her chamber so she could practice kneeling. They said she died well. Her last words, trembling with fear and dignity, "I die a queen, but I would rather have been the wife of Culpeper." Henry ate dinner that night in silence. With Catherine's blood, the last traces of the man who had once loved music and poetry seemed to vanish. Only the tyrant remained. Yet in his heart, the image of Jane Seymour still flickered like a dying candle, the one woman he did not destroy. When he finally died, a decade later, his coffin was carried to Windsor, to rest beside hers. And though time would crumble their faces and fade their names from living memory, the truth of their story remains. She was the only one he ever truly loved, and the only one he could never forgive for leaving him. The king had his heir. The realm had its peace. But England itself had been baptized in sorrow. Every birth, every wedding, every coronation in the Tudor age would carry that echo, the sound of a mother's last breath in a palace that could not keep her alive. After Jane Seymour's death, the court of Henry VIII turned cold again, as if joy itself had been banished. The king, swollen and scarred, wandered through his own palaces like a ghost, too proud to haunt anyone but himself. The wound in his leg festered, the pain that never left him, turned his moods from silence to thunder in the space of a breath. Yet if monsters grow lonely, ministers whispered that the king should marry again. Not for love, that word had long been burned out of him, but for politics, for the fragile alliance that could keep England safe from the wrath of Rome. And so began the search for a bride who might heal a kingdom that could not bear another wound. The painter Hans Holbein was sent across Europe like a royal matchmaker with brushes instead of words. He painted portraits of princesses and noblewomen, each canvas a gamble of diplomacy and desire. When he brought back the likeness of Anne of Cleves, the king stopped to stare. The woman in the portrait looked serene, composed, her eyes soft with humility. Henry declared that he had found his next queen, but portraits, like prayers, can lie. When Anne arrived in England on a frozen January day in the year 1540, Henry's heart turned to stone. She was plain, he said, and smelled of foreign oils. When he met her in disguise, she failed to recognize him, and the laughter of his courtiers cut deeper than any blade. Humiliation to Henry was more fatal than poison. He called her the Flanders mare, and their wedding night became a farce, whispered about in every chamber. Still, Anne bore the shame with dignity. She endured his coldness, his mockery, his refusal even to touch her. For 6 months, she played the queen in name only. Until the king's pride found a convenient escape, he declared the marriage unconsummated and sought an annulment. Anne, wiser than her predecessors, did not fight. She agreed with humility, calling Henry her beloved brother, and in return was rewarded with riches, estates, and safety, the rarest gift of all. She lived quietly in England, free from danger, free from the crown's poison. Of all the women who had crossed the orbit of Henry VIII, she alone would die peacefully, still wealthy, still alive, her portrait smiling faintly as if she had outwitted death itself. But peace does not linger long in a house built on ghosts. Even as Anne packed her trunks, another girl caught the king's eye, Catherine Howard. a cousin of Anne Boleyn, young, bright, and foolish enough to believe she could warm a monster's heart. She was barely more than a child, 16 or 17, full of laughter, her skin unscarred by fear, to the aging king, bloated and bandaged. She was not just beautiful, she was an illusion of youth returned. When she called him my sweet father, he roared with laughter. When she danced, his ulcers seemed to fade for a moment. He drowned her in jewels, in fur, in silks so heavy she could barely walk. He called her Rose without thorn. The courtiers smiled and bowed. But behind their masks, they saw disaster coming. Catherine's charm was her undoing. She had grown up in a household where flirtation was currency, where girls were taught to smile first and think later. She carried secrets in her past, whispers of lovers, letters hidden, a recklessness that would have been harmless in any other life. But she was now the wife of a king whose temper was sharper than his sword. When rumors reached Henry that she had known men before him, he was enraged. When he learned she might still be meeting one in secret, his fury became almost divine. He felt mocked, betrayed, emasculated before his court. The monster that Anne Boleyn had awakened now came fully alive again. Catherine was arrested in the dead of night. They say she screamed as they dragged her through the corridors of Hampton Court, that she broke free and ran toward the royal chapel, pounding on the doors and crying for the king to forgive her. Henry never answered. The guards pulled her away, her voice echoing down the marble halls like a ghost that refused to understand she was already dead. In the tower, she wept, then laughed, then wept again. Fear had burned through reason. When they told her she would die by beheading, she asked for the block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her neck upon it. On the morning of her execution, February the 13th, in the year 1542, Catherine walked barefoot to the scaffold, pale and trembling, but composed. The crowd expected hysteria, but she surprised them all. "I die a queen," she said softly. "But I would rather have been the wife of Culpeper." Her head fell cleanly, and for a moment, the silence that followed was so complete that it felt like reverence. Somewhere in the palace, Henry ate breakfast and said nothing. After her death, it grew quieter. The rage no longer erupted. It simmered. The pain in his leg worsened. He spent his days surrounded by physicians who could not heal him, and courtiers who could no longer flatter him without choking on the stench. The man who had once commanded armies now needed to be carried from room to room. Yet even as his flesh decayed, his mind returned to the cycle that had consumed him all his life, the need to control what he feared most: love. And so he married one last time, to Catherine Parr, a widow and scholar who had the intelligence to survive him. Catherine Parr tended to him like a nurse, tending to a dying lion. She soothed his temper with logic, humoured his vanity with devotion, and when she spoke of faith, she spoke softly enough not to sound like a challenge. For the first time, perhaps, Henry married a woman who understood that his love was a form of illness. She read to him at night, calmed his fevers, and wrote prayers for his soul. But even she nearly fell to the same fate. When her interest in religious reform grew too bold, enemies at court whispered that she was a heretic. Orders for her arrest were drawn. Warned in time, she rushed to the king's chambers, fell to her knees, and begged forgiveness. Henry, touched by her tears, declared that he had only wished to test her loyalty. She kissed his hand, and the axe was put away this time. By then, the king was more wound than man. His nights were filled with pain and hallucinations. He dreamed of his dead wives, of the tower, of the eyes that had looked up at him one last time. When he died, Catherine Parr wept not for the man he was, but for the kingdom he had left behind, broken by his hunger and his fear. And in the silence that followed his death, One truth shimmered like light through dust. The women he had destroyed had shaped England more deeply than he ever could. Anne of Cleves, who survived him with wit. Catherine Howard, who died too young. Catherine Parr, who endured. Jane Seymour, who gave him his son. Anne Boleyn, who gave him his daughter. And Catherine of Aragon, who gave him his crown. All their names, carved beneath his shadow, became the real story of his reign. Henry's legacy was written not in laws or battles, but in the echoes of 6 voices, some silenced, some surviving, and the single question they left behind: how can love, when placed in the hands of power, become the cruelest weapon of all? The answer lay buried with him, beneath the stones of Windsor, where the king who destroyed his wives finally slept beside the only one he called pure. But the ghosts of the others still walked the corridors of his palaces, whispering in the dark, waiting for history to remember that before there was empire, before there was reformation, before there was power, there were 6 women, and every one of them died of love. In the final years of Henry's life, the English court became a mausoleum dressed in gold. The palaces that had once echoed with laughter and the clatter of armor now whispered with the sound of dripping wax and the shuffle of servants afraid to breathe too loudly. The king no longer strode through the halls like thunder. He was carried, wheezing, wrapped in furs to hide the trembling of his hands. The smell of rot, sweet, metallic, and unholy, followed him like incense. Even his dogs, once doted on like princes, began to shrink from his presence. There was something unnatural in his silence now, as though the man had become more ghost than flesh, already rehearsing his death before it came. His courtiers continued to flatter him, but their voices trembled. They knew what happened to those who reminded the king of his mortality. The doctors came daily, lancing his ulcers, draining foul-smelling pus into silver bowls. They burned his wounds with hot irons, and the screams that filled the corridors sounded less like pain than penance. Sometimes, when the agony ebbed, he asked for music, old songs he had composed as a young man, melodies about love and eternity. His voice, once bright, cracked and rasped like paper. When he played the virginals, the notes drifted through the rooms like ghosts of a world that had already left him behind. Henry had become both priest and sacrifice of his own religion. He prayed not to God, but to the reflection in the mirror, the once golden prince, who stared back at him now through eyes swollen with age and sin. He had believed himself chosen, destined, immortal. Now, every breath proved him wrong. He raged against it. He signed edicts and death warrants in the same trembling hand that could barely lift a cup of wine. He told himself that the fire of his will could outlast the rot of his flesh. But the truth, whispered by everyone and spoken by none, was that the king was dying by inches, and England was quietly preparing to live without him. Catherine Parr, his last wife, moved like a shadow at his bedside. She read him psalms, pressed cool cloths to his forehead, and wrote prayers for his soul in her delicate script. Sometimes he watched her with the dull wonder of a man who no longer remembered what tenderness felt like. There were moments, brief as candlelight, when he spoke to her gently, as if through her he could reach the boy he once was, the boy who wrote poetry, who dreamed of honor, who had not yet learned that love was a kind of hunger. But then the pain would return, and the monster would wake again. He spent his last months haunted by visions. Servants whispered that he spoke to the dead in the dark, to Catherine of Aragon, to Anne, to Jane, to the ones whose names he had turned into curses and prayers. He would call their names softly, then curse them for leaving him. He dreamed of the tower, of heads falling, of the black velvet that lined the coffins. Once, he woke screaming for monks, more monks, though he had destroyed the monasteries with his own hand. Some said it was madness. Others said it was the conscience he had spent a lifetime avoiding finally clawing its way to the surface. Outside the royal chambers, England was changing. The old faith was gone. The new one barely born. The churches were stripped bare of saints and gold. Their windows, empty eyes staring into grey skies. The land itself seemed uncertain, as if mourning what it had become. The poor, once sheltered by monasteries, now wandered the roads begging. The nobles hoarded the king's favour, knowing that when he died, everything would shift again. No one prayed for Henry's recovery, only for his passing. Yet the man refused to die. Every day the priests prepared the rites, and every day he clung to life, as if by defying death he could prove his divinity one last time. When death finally came for him, it came quietly, almost gently. On a winter morning in January of the year 1547, the courtiers did not weep. They bowed their heads and began calculating their futures. The body of the king, so heavy and bloated that it took 6 men to move it, was wrapped in lead and placed in a coffin. As the funeral procession rolled toward Windsor, the cart broke under the weight, and the coffin burst open on the cobblestones. Blood and fluid spilled onto the street. Dogs ran forward and licked at the mess before they could be stopped. The priests called it an accident. The people called it judgment. Henry was buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife he had claimed to love most, the one who had given him his son and taken his soul in return. Above their tomb was carved a single phrase, Rex Invictus, the unconquered king. Yet the title rang hollow. In truth, he had been conquered long ago, not by armies or rivals, but by his own body, his own heart, his own hunger. The man who had broken a church and built an empire had ended as nothing more than flesh rotting beneath marble, and yet the crown he had stained with blood did not die with him. It passed to his son Edward. The sickly child Jane had died to bring into the world. The boy would reign only a handful of years before death took him too, leaving the kingdom to the daughters Henry had once denied. First Mary, then Elizabeth. They would fight each other in faith and fire, but they would also complete what their father began. Through them, Henry's ghost ruled on, his shadow stretching across a century of English history. The Reformation, the Empire, the modern monarchy, all bore the shape of his will. It is easy to hate Henry VIII, easier still to pity him. But perhaps the cruelest truth is that he was not a monster born. He was a man who mistook desire for destiny and power for salvation. In the end, his crown outlived him, gleaming on the heads of those he would never have allowed to rule. The world moved forward, and the man who had once believed himself immortal became a cautionary tale, told by candlelight, the king who broke everything to prove he could not be broken. And somewhere, far beneath the stones of Windsor, the bones of Henry and Jane lie side by side, the unconquered king and the silent queen, surrounded by the echoes of all the others who came before. In that darkness, there is no gold, not music, no power, only dust, and the whisper of a question that has never stopped haunting England. What does it profit a man to gain a kingdom, if he must first lose his soul? When Henry VIII finally died, England exhaled, not in relief, but in confusion. The monster was gone, yet his shadow clung to the throne like oil. For nearly 4 decades, he had ruled not merely as a king, but as a god who had rewritten heaven to suit his will. Now the nation stood trembling in the echo of his name. The question that no one dared voice aloud was the one that mattered most. Could England survive the children of Henry VIII? Or had the curse already been sealed in their blood? The first to bear that burden was the boy he had worshipped, Edward, the son of Jane Seymour, the miracle child, whose birth had cost a queen her life. When he took the throne in the year 1547, he was 9 years old, small and pale, a scholar rather than a soldier. The crown sat too heavily on his head. The orb and sceptre looked absurd in his small hands. Yet to the reformers of England, he was the living promise of their new faith. The Protestant saviour sent to carry his father's revolution to completion. The people saw in him not a boy, but a prophecy, and prophecy, like kingship, is a dangerous inheritance. Behind him stood men who ruled in his name. First, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. His uncle, who styled himself Protector of the Realm. Somerset was ambitious and devout, convinced that he could purify England's soul by tearing the last remnants of Catholic ritual from its heart. He tore down altars, smashed stained glass, melted chalices for coin. Monks were replaced by bureaucrats, abbeys by profit. The poor starved in the ruins of monasteries that had once fed them. When rebellion flared in the countryside, Somerset crushed it with cannons and fire, telling himself he was defending God's truth. All the while, the young king studied Latin and scripture, watching his realm bleed in the name of righteousness. Edward loved books more than men. His tutors praised his intelligence, his grasp of theology, his piety, but the lessons he absorbed most deeply were the lessons of isolation, that power is lonely, that purity is cruel, that faith demands sacrifice. When Somerset fell from favour and was replaced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the boy learned how easily loyalty could turn to treason. Northumberland smiled where Somerset scowled, but his ambition ran colder. He whispered to Edward that the future of the kingdom depended on his will, that his sisters, Mary the Catholic and Elizabeth the bastard Protestant, would destroy all he had been raised to protect. Together they plotted to secure the throne for Lady Jane Grey, the gentle, learned girl whom Northumberland had bound to his own family by marriage. Edward was dying, even as he wrote the order that disinherited his sisters. The disease, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps something darker, consumed him slowly. He coughed blood into linen, his fingers trembling as he signed his name. He was 15 when he died, pale and quiet, the candle of his father's legacy guttering in a wind no one could stop. He had ruled as a boy king, but he had died as an idea pure, cold, and childless. Then came Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. The child Henry had declared illegitimate and left to rot in her mother's exile. She told herself she was saving souls. In truth, she was trying to save her mother's ghost. But Mary's faith had been hardened by pain. She had watched her mother die, praying for justice that never came. Watched her father remarry again and again while calling her a bastard. Now, she would prove to God and the world that she was her mother's daughter. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, cold, foreign janitor, politically sound, turned her heart into a battlefield. The people who once hailed her began to whisper that she had sold England to Spain. Rebellion followed, and Mary answered it with fire. The burnings at Smithfield began Protestants chained to stakes, their screams rising like hymns to a God they refused to renounce. She believed she was cleansing England. The world saw only smoke. Her reign was short and filled with tragedy. The phantom pregnancy that consumed her body became a cruel symbol of her rule, swollen with hope, hollow with disappointment. She waited for a child who never came, her belly growing as her heart broke. When she realized the truth, she locked herself in her chamber for days, praying until her knees bled. The second phantom swelling that followed was her death. In November of 1558, the Queen who had burned England for her faith slipped away in silence, whispering her mother's name. The fires went out, and so the crown passed to Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the girl Henry had once refused to acknowledge. Her childhood had been spent in the shadow of her mother's execution and her sister's suspicion. She had learned patience the way others learn breathing. When she took the throne, England was weary of blood, weary of kings who called themselves divine, weary of God being invoked to justify cruelty. Elizabeth offered something different, not peace, but balance. She called herself the Virgin Queen, married to her kingdom, untouched by any man's will. Her faith was her own invention, Catholic ritual in Protestant dress, a compromise between ghosts. Una here. England began to heal, not through mercy, but through exhaustion. She filled her court with poets and spies, turned the arts into diplomacy, and laughter into armor. She danced with ambassadors, flirted with traitors, and held her nation together with the sheer gravity of her will. She remembered her father's fire, her mother's wit, her sister's faith, and turned them all into tools of survival. But even she could not escape the echo of the past. Every suitor reminded her of the father who had murdered love. Every mirror reminded her of the mother who had died for it. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, 3 children of the same tyrant. 3 answers to the same wound. The boy who prayed himself to death. The woman who burned for salvation. The queen who chose loneliness over love. They were the living proof that Henry's curse was not the sword but the seed. Each had inherited his brilliance, his pride, his loneliness. Each ruled in the shadow of a man who had remade God in his image. And though their reigns could not have been more different, all 3 left the same legacy, the knowledge that England would forever be a country built not on faith, nor on mercy, but on fear, the fear of what happens when a crown believes itself eternal. When Elizabeth died decades later, unmarried and childless, she was buried in Westminster Abbey. Above her sister Mary, on their shared tomb, the inscription reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb. We sisters here lie down together in hope of the resurrection." Yet beneath that hope lies the unspoken truth that their resurrection had already come. Not in heaven, but in history, they had become the afterlife of their father's sins, each in their way, rewriting the meaning of the crown he had corrupted. The man who sought a son had left behind 2 queens, and through them, a nation that would never again be the same. England outlived Henry, but it never escaped him. His ghost walked beside every monarch who followed, whispering of power, of faith, of desire. The children of the storm had rebuilt the kingdom, but the thunder still lingered faint, eternal, and waiting to return. Centuries passed, yet the echo of Henry VIII's footsteps never faded. The man who had torn apart Christendom, who had married 6 times and buried half of Europe's hope beneath his throne, still walked the corridors of English history. His death had not ended his reign, it had only transformed it into legend. England, in a strange and terrible way, never stopped loving him, because he was everything the English feared and desired in themselves: ruthless, brilliant, hungry, magnificent, and doomed. After Elizabeth's long reign, the Tudor line ended, but Henry's ghost endured, woven into the very bones of the realm. His break with Rome became England's spine. His obsession with heirs became the foundation of its politics. His pride became its myth. Every monarch who followed from the Stuarts to the Windsors lived in the echo of his creation. The idea that a crown could bend heaven to its will. The palaces he built still stood like monuments to both triumph and madness, their walls heavy with the breath of the women who had died to fill them. Visitors to Hampton Court still claim that, on winter nights, when the fog thickens over the Thames, they can hear the slow, dragging limp of the king's steps echoing through the great hall. They say the air still carries the smell of burning tallow and feverish sweat. Servants of later generations refused to walk those halls after midnight, swearing that they heard the faint creak of armor and the murmured words of a man asking for forgiveness. The ghosts of his queens linger too, a flash of silk, a whisper of laughter, a cry muffled by centuries. Perhaps they are not haunting him, but haunting history itself, forever demanding to be remembered not just as victims, but as witnesses. Henry's face survived in portraits, his small, pig-like eyes and massive shoulders frozen in oil and varnish. For generations, artists softened him, painting the king as noble and wise, as if beauty could sanctify what power had destroyed. But behind that thick, flat gaze lies something deeper, the eternal question that has haunted every ruler since: what price must be paid to control the story of one's own life? Henry paid it in wives, in faith, in flesh, in the lives of those who dared to love him. And yet, in the cruel arithmetic of history, his gamble worked. The England he left behind became an empire. But perhaps his truest legacy was not empire, it was inheritance. Edward's fragile intellect, Mary's burning devotion, Elizabeth's glittering loneliness, all were fragments of him. Splinters from the same crown. Through them, Henry became immortal, not in the way he wanted, through sons and bloodlines, but through the endless retelling of his sins. The king who feared death so much that he defied God ensured that his name would never die. In every textbook, every stage play, every whisper of scandal that bore the word Tudor, there was still that same heartbeat of arrogance, the rhythm of a man who could not accept that he was only human. He once declared that kings were not made by God, but born as gods themselves. That belief poisoned everything he touched. Yet it also gave birth to modern England, a nation that learned to live without the Pope, that learned to see its monarchs as both divine and doomed.